Hello and welcome to the Eclectic Radical. As always, I'm Chris Richards, the Eclectic Radical. My guest co-host Kennedy Cooper is still with us, for which I'm tremendously happy. Evening, Kennedy.
Evening.
And tonight, our guest, who many of you who have been watching me since my last show already know, is Joseph Kishore, General Secretary of the Socialist Equality Party and their recent candidate for president, also editor-in-chief of the World Socialist website. And I'm always glad when Joseph is on the show, because I always get retweeted by one of my favorite fantasy authors when Joseph is on the show.
Stephen Bruce.
Yes, Stephen Bruce.
Just by the way, I'm the editor-in-chief of the World Socialist website.
Oh, no, that's right.
A national secretary of the Socialist Equality Party.
Okay, see, my brain doesn't work anymore. Sorry about that.
That's all right. That's right.
Oh,
Greetings. Thanks for having me.
oh, it's my pleasure.
I'm happy to be here.
Oh, it's always a pleasure to talk. I'm still reeling from everything that's happened since, well, I guess 2016, really. So, I mean, if I try to pack a whole lot in to an hour and a half, I apologize in advance. I'm really feeling right now like people should really start becoming more radical as they see how little things are changing and how close the good cop and the bad cop actually are in what they're actually going to do. I think a lot of people were really expecting Biden being president to somehow make the COVID mess better, and that's clearly not happening.
Yeah. Well, today we're meeting with under conditions of a pretty horrific milestone. 500,000 people in the United States dead from the coronavirus, which is an astonishing. Really, we're writing on it today, but I mean, this is not just a tragedy; it's a monumental crime, and I would also say a political turning point. This has been an absolute, but it's not just Trump; it was the whole political establishment.
Well,
for this.
Congress has repeatedly shown that they really don't want to help anyone unless they absolutely feel like they can't not help anyone.
Well, they wanted to help someone. They helped Wall Street with a few $1 trillion, and the billionaires are doing much better than they were a year ago, which is astonishing.
Yeah, there's no oh, maybe we need to cut the check down when it's a check they're writing to Wall Street. It's just whatever amount.
What's
whatever they ask for, it seems like it's right out the door.
What's really funny about that too is right around the same time that all this was happening and they were starting to make more and more money, but before everyone knew it, you started to hear all this talk about, well, capitalism has to change. Capitalism has to be more humane. Capitalism can't put profit first all the time. But while they're saying this, they're making billions more off people getting sick and dying.
Well, yeah, I mean, but that is capitalism. I mean, I think that is what, that's the conclusion that people are going to draw from this. I mean, you can't go through an experience like this with such a level of mass death. And then everything else, I mean, the society has been devastated and the tens of millions of people unemployed and a whole generation. I mean, their futures have been devastated. People massive levels of debt. I mean, you can't go through this without it having a profound impact on consciousness. And I think, it's irrefutably exposed American and really world capitalism for what it is. And then in the midst of this, you have billionaires who have increased their wealth by $1 trillion. I mean, how can you have a more clear and devastating indictment of the whole social and economic order? I mean, it's almost impossible to imagine. I mean, it's, this has been it really has been a transformative event in I think, not just American, but world history. There's sort of no going, the ruling class can't go back from what it's done.
You're seeing, while it's by no means perfect, obviously it's it's liberal democratic reformism, but you're seeing Spain guarantee a minimum income and do so, they're saying, permanently, even after the plague ends. Whereas in the United States, we're going to have month after month of record evictions, and nobody's saying anything about helping to pay people's rent.
Yeah, although I don't know the details in Spain about the income. I suspect it's pretty limited. But I think the main policy in Spain, which Podemos actually in the Spanish, the coalition government, Socialist Party and Podemos implemented, was essentially the same policy that they implemented here. That is, that there would be no real restraints on the spread of the virus. The back to work campaign, the back to school campaign, Podemos has really been at the forefront of that in Spain. Because whether it's sort of right wing or nominally left wing, but not in fact left wing governments, whether throughout Europe and here in the United States, the policy has been more or less the same. Because it's a policy which has been dictated by the interests of the ruling class. I think there's the issue of the fact no one has any assistance, but connected to that is the fact that they rejected actual measures to stop the virus. I mean, what would have been required? You have the shutdown of non-essential production. You have the shutdown of schools with full income to all workers. I mean, they talk about, $1,400 this or whatever, $600 here. It's all actually avoiding the real question, which is that you have to have full income.
It should be
every worker affected.
Yeah, I mean, you should be making the employers pay. You should be paying everybody $2,000, $3,000 a month.
Yeah,
I mean, there's no excuse for this sort of, well, stay home, don't go anywhere yet, but not actually doing anything to facilitate staying home.
Yeah, and also the small businesses that have been devastated with no real assistance. And I mean, it's been a massive social disaster. And if you, beyond that, I mean, you think of the impact of economic, social dislocation, the psychological trauma produced by this. I mean, there has been nothing mobilized in society, the social resources, to deal with a mass event like this. The only thing that was done was that they handed, as you say, unlimited resources to the banks. And they said, Federal Reserve opened its coffers and poured it into Wall Street and said, take what you want. And, how do you have, the stock market is at record levels under conditions of a massive healthcare catastrophe, an economic disaster, depression levels of unemployment. And, it's somewhat cliche, but Dickens, the best of times and the worst of times. Well, it's the worst of times for the vast majority of the population. It's actually the best of times for the rich.
Yeah, a Gilded Age.
The second Gilded Age is exactly what we've got. And it's funny. One of my first few shows, I had Alan Grayson on, former congressman, not at all a socialist, though I suppose decent as far as liberals go. But he and I were talking, and we did the math. He feels pretty much the same way about the market bailouts that we do, at least. And for the same amount that was dumped into foreclosure markets in half a day, not even everything they dumped into it in one day, but just half a day, it could have paid every American citizen $20,000.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And they just burned it up essentially in a system where when they do that, if the price goes up again and there's a profit, they give that profit back to the Wall Street people they bought that asset from. But if there's a loss, the government eats the loss.
Mm-hmm.
So it's win-win for Wall Street and lose-lose for the ordinary citizen when it comes to that.
Yeah, and of course, all of this money has to be paid for in one form or another, which is, on the one hand, you're driving the insistence that workers have to go back to the job to produce profits, even under unsafe conditions. And there's going to be massive levels of austerity, social cuts, budget cuts throughout the country. I mean, they have to pay for it in some form. the bailout of the rich. It's got to come. It's going to come from the height of the working class.
Well, they certainly can't cut defense spending. That would expose the empire in its moment of weakness.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and a significant Biden is coming in, and one of the immediate sort of focal points of the administration is the campaign against Russia, also China. Mm-hmm. They're sort of picking up where Trump left off on the lies about China created this. I mean, it doesn't. None of it addresses the fact that China was actually able to contain the virus, whereas the United States proved absolutely incapable of doing so.
Well, people in the Biden administration are repeating the Trump conspiracy theory that it got out of a lab.
Yeah.
So it's not just that this was somehow Trump's propaganda. That's the official propaganda from both sides.
Yeah. What's distressing to me now is that it seems like at this point, Joe Biden is kind of like maybe making things worse. At the moment, there's no relief payments for anyone. And I don't even want to call them stimulus checks. They're relief payments. These are, these is to provide relief during the time of economic hardship. This is not to, give people spending money. The way, like, I don't know, it seems like a lot of the politicians kind of like talk about it that way, as if like they're doing us a favor. Here, go get your new TV or whatever that you missed out on. It's like, no, what we're missing out on is meals, not a TV. This is a lot more serious than that.
Right.
But like, yeah, Joe Biden hasn't sent anything yet. And furthermore, he's pushing this school reopening. I just want to say, like, my governor here, I'm in New Mexico. She's done an okay job, not perfect, but like better than most governors with handling the pandemic. And she established some very strict criteria for reopening things. Now that Joe Biden's in office, suddenly that criteria is kind of getting relaxed so that we can reopen schools. And it just seems like, okay, what changed? What changed? Nothing. I don't see a change. I see a few people getting the vaccine, but I don't see a change that provokes me thinking we're ready to just jump into reopening schools, when a couple months ago, Trump was in office and she was saying, no, we got to be as cautious as possible. What changed?
Nancy Pelosi said what changed.
Well, it's interesting. That's significant. I mean, it's certainly been a real focal point of Biden, the reopening of the schools, and they even got the CDC to come in, which is really, I think it's a really filthy operation, which they are sort of to lie and basically argue that it's safe to reopen schools, and they're also sort of vilification of teachers in a really filthy way. To suggest that somehow teachers are harming children by refusing to go back to classrooms.
Well, they're selling this as it being bad for kids to not be in school.
Yeah, well, that's been the line, but now it's the Democratic Party which is really spearheading this. And in California, in Chicago, of course, which is run by Democrats, they really forced the reopening of schools over mass opposition of teachers who are trying to fight against it. In New York City, they're reopening schools, and in Los Angeles. So I think Chicago is really the sort of the spearhead of that, because there was an eruption of opposition. Teachers were saying we're not going to go back under unsafe conditions. We have to have the vaccine, and the schools should be shut down until the virus is under control. Because it's not just a question of the teachers, because that's the other way that they're framing it. Oh, the teachers are just selfish. And they want, no, I mean, it's a question of stopping the spread of the virus as a whole, and the lie that children can't control. I mean, Biden got on the town hall the other day, and to this like 8-year-old kid, absolutely lied to her and said, oh, children can't contract it. They can't spread it to their parents. It's false.
Didn't the whole media excoriate Trump when he said kids couldn't get it?
Yeah, well, now they turn on a dime, and it's the Democrats are doing it, and this is now. But the fact of the matter is, whatever the differences Trump and the Democrats had over the past year, it has been a bipartisan policy.
Yes.
I mean, Trump. Well, maybe we'll talk about the fascists, because I think it's very much connected. They mobilized Trump mobilized the fascists in order to enforce the policy of no restraints on the coronavirus. That's what really at the center of, particularly over the past year.
It was the people who were protesting Corona lockdowns were the same people who were organizing that invasion of the Capitol.
Yeah, absolutely. And plotting to assassinate the governor of Michigan because she was fairly limited restraints. That's who they mobilized. But the fact was that the Democrats were also implementing this policy, and they had certain rhetorical differences. But now you see with Biden the real content, that this was a bipartisan policy to essentially prevent anything that would impinge on the wealth of the rich and the endless rise of the share values. That was excluded. And that they implement, and 500,000 people have died. I mean, it's staggering. I think even now the sort of understanding of what has happened. I mean, I think people it's had a profound impact. But I think as the experience sort of deepens in people's minds, and you think really 500,000 people, one out of every 620 people in the country, I think something like that. It's the entire population of Kansas City. Or Miami. It's more than that. The population of Miami is like 450,000. So more than the entire population of Miami has died. More than the U.S. combat. I mean, Trump or Biden made the reference. U.S. combat fatalities in World War I, World War II, and Vietnam combined. Yeah, it's just a staggering loss of life, and it's treated as if, well, Biden spoke today, and he gave one of his completely pablum, sanctimonious, empty speeches full of cliches and everything else. And he said, well, America has more deaths than any other country in the world. He made that point. But he didn't suggest, even in the slightest, give an answer as to why. What explains the particular incapacity of American society to deal with a social crisis like this?
Well, and I think there's like a religious aspect to a lot of this stuff, that these Puritan values are so interwoven into our culture that a lot of people don't realize that they have what are essentially religious values that rely on magical thinking, but they are, because the thing about this is people keep kind of treating it like, well, it's just a disease. Diseases just do what diseases do. And it's like, no, the entire basis of human society was us going from saying, yes, diseases do what diseases do, to saying, no, we're going to try to provide healthcare to one another. This was one of the first things that brought humans together and form, some of the cornerstones of what we have as a society today, with people saying we got to figure out healthcare so that we die of less stuff. And so to say, oh, this is just how it is. No, this isn't some biblical situation that we're in. We're in a real life situation where we have tools, technology, and information that could take those numbers down drastically, and we're just not doing it.
Yeah. Well, speaking of, first we'll put this up, since we were just talking about this. This is true. Teachers died in Florida last year when they reopened schools. Teachers died in New York when they first experimented with reopening schools.
Were those comments from...
And this one, since September, they've had parts of New York, and they've been spreading it.
Yeah. Well, in relationship to Florida, it's worth noting that the leading sort of opponent of the reopenings of schools, Rebecca Jones, the whistleblower who was victimized, she's been really adamant in insisting that reopening schools is unsafe. And for that she was persecuted by the governor of Florida, DeSantis, and it's really been actually left out, hung to dry by the whole political establishment, because Biden's pursuing basically the same policy.
Well, and yet you'll hear that it's coronavirus response is getting better under Biden.
So if I understand correctly, there was a logistics issue with the way the vaccine was going out that was supposedly, and I say supposedly because you never know what's true and what's not until you've dissected everything from 5 different sources lately. And I haven't gone through everything yet, but supposedly there was an issue with disseminating the vaccine, to the states, and then just expecting the states to know what to do with them and have the money to do it under the Trump administration. But the Republicans had basically cut that off at the knees. As much as I hate to give the Democrats credit for anything at all, when the Republicans blocked the HEROES Act, they blocked money to the states that would have paid for things like disseminating the vaccines once they got there. But that money was blocked, so state governments are still broke. So when the Trump administration allegedly just dumped stuff on the states with no way for them to move it around, the states were like, what do you want us to do? We're broke, and everything hung up. The West Virginia, which is as broke as any other state, did really, really well at getting those vaccines disseminated as quickly as they got them, and of using all their doses to best effect without wasting anything, which makes you wonder if all the excuses all the other states are making are legit or not, because there are states with more capacity than West Virginia.
For sure.
Well, I mean, because there's all sorts of, the sort of catastrophe at every stage of this, and the incapacity of organizing. I think that the deeper issue is the inability of a society which is based upon profit to address a mass social problem like this. And not only, I think this is critical, not only within the United States, but internationally, because this was, by its very nature, the pandemic, a global problem. The pandemic, it doesn't respect borders. And now you have all sorts of new variants emerging in the UK and Brazil and South Africa, also here in the United States, and they quickly then spread. There's a lot of concern that there's been a certain dip now over the past several weeks, but that could quickly reverse itself as some of the more infectious strains begin to rapidly spread. Osterholm, who was actually at a certain point a advisor for the Biden campaign, although now he's been basically sidelined, has been repeatedly warning that this is sort of the lull before the storm, and has been very concerned that the situation is going to actually get much worse over the coming weeks, which makes all the more critical, even now, that emergency measures have to be taken. But they completely reject that, and it's capitalism. I think that's the basic issue. And then you have the situation in Texas, as if the whole thing couldn't get any worse. The entire state of Texas, electricity grid breaks down because of the winter storm, because they don't plan for anything, and everything is subordinate. And people are in the United States, supposedly the richest country in the world. People are freezing to death in their homes and on the streets. I mean, the water cut off.
And while Texas has been getting the attention, 6,000 people in Salem, Oregon were still without power earlier today.
I heard about that. Yeah.
I have friends in Salem. They keep me pretty well posted on what goes on there. I know more about what happens the next town over and in New York City sometimes than I do in my hometown, just because of where my information comes from. But yeah, so we're not talking about Oregon, but we're talking about Texas. Okay, what's different between Oregon and Texas, and why are we talking about one and not the other? Oregon's a really blue state. Let's say that.
Yeah, so it's you can't admit that the government of Oregon is failing in a similar kind of way, because that would, imply things.
Well, it's like as bad, and this is a good comment again, as bad as DeSantis has been for Florida, the disasters in New York and California under Democrat governors has received the brush it under the rug treatment from the media by and large. Now, I will gloat a little bit here. Kennedy and I spoke to Ron Kim a few weeks before he started going on the mainstream media to expose just how big a gangster and crook and how badly Andy Cuomo really handled coronavirus in New York. So I feel a little ahead of the curve that we were talking about that a couple of weeks before the mainstream media. But that's starting to come out now with New York. And I don't think they can keep it brushed under the rug in California forever. But they're doing a really good job of keeping it brushed under the rug here in Oregon.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and in California, the Democrats have, in San Francisco, they tried to take the school district to court in order to force them to reopen. It's been a bipartisan policy, absolutely. The
main difference between the Trump coronavirus policy and the Biden coronavirus policy is Biden takes everything that Trump says and adds the word safely to it. So we're not going to just reopen schools as fast as possible. We're going to open schools as fast as possible safely. We're not going to get everybody back to work as fast as possible. We're going to get everybody to work as fast as possible safely. Yeah. And they just add the word safely to everything like they really mean something by saying it.
Yeah.
And this is sorry, go ahead, Kennedy.
Well, I just want to ask who's getting the vaccines too? And we know these vaccines may not be wholly effective because there's these mutant strains and blah, blah, but who's getting the vaccines? Because one of the arguments I keep hearing is that, the vaccines are rolling out. Tens of millions of people have the vaccine, it's going to be 50 million soon or whatever. But we have, 350 million-ish people in this country. Who's getting those vaccines? Because the idea is that we reopen schools and regular working class folks go back to their physical jobs, but those people aren't getting the vaccines. The vaccines are going to wealthy people and high-ranking government employees and people like that first in many states. Now it varies from state to state a little bit, but I just don't understand what the logic is of things are improving when this vaccine is not being distributed in a way that is equitable or that promotes the health of the people that are going to be most affected by things opening back up.
I'm an essential worker with the exception of whatever sick time or vacation time or FMLA time I've used to be able to stay home and hide out when I can to mitigate risk. I've pretty much been going to work every day since this started. Nobody's talking to us at work about when we're going to get vaccinated.
Mm-hmm. It's sort of ignored the fact that you have the auto plants are still open. You have a huge sector of really actually non-essential production. Well, workers are going back to the job. You're working in factories that are hot. You can't effectively wear a mask. It's where social distancing is not enforced. All of this is still going on. It's as if and actually, if you read the scientific studies, what are the most effective measures to stop the spread of the pandemic? What are they? There's obviously the basic. Masks and everything, but the most effective measures: shut down schools, universities, shut down non-essential production is actually the top issue. Non-essential production has to be shut down, which the World Socialist website called for from the beginning, that you have to take this measure. But of course, you can't just shut down non-essential production. You have to provide the workers with full income while they're doing it, in order to ensure that people can actually live.
Right,
and that's of course what they absolutely reject.
And and they have no desire to help small business because big business can't steal if small businesses don't fail.
Yeah.
And that's one of the most important rules of this new hyper predatory capitalism. Big businesses survive by devouring small businesses like predators.
Well, and didn't it seem like what qualified as an essential business in the end was just big?
This is the
it didn't necessarily always matter what services.
This is the perfect transition to our fascism discussion, because this is where we start to get into what the German communists of the 1920s and 1930s called social fascism, which was that they had all sorts of nice ideas about how to make the system better, but they still wanted to keep the same capitalist system going on the economic side. And they were still willing to do whatever they needed to preserve and protect it. The very first split was when the Social Democratic Party in Germany decided they were going to support the war effort in World War I. And then after World War I, when you had a essentially socialist revolution that overthrew the Kaiser, you saw this reaction against the socialist revolution, not by right-wingers, but by the Social Democratic Party that wanted to run the new liberal democracy. The right-wing thugs who killed Rosa Luxemburg were not doing it on their own accord. They were literally in the pay of the Social Democratic Party of Germany at the time. This stuff gets lost when people talk, well, why didn't everybody coordinate against Hitler? Well, because the people asking them to join up had been killing them. And so when you see this system where the so-called we're the working class party is killing the people advocating for a working class democracy, it sort of undercuts their legitimacy. And you see that in the Democratic Party today, when even these very mild sort of 1960s social democratic ideas are dismissed as horrible, horrible socialism from the bowels of China and the Soviet Union and Cuba. And I don't think that things are worse in Cuba than they are here now. But even if I did, I don't really see how we're better.
Well, I think there's a lot of important issues which are raised, and historical questions. I think first on the question of social fascism, that was a policy which was, or sort of a line that was advanced by the Stalinist Communist Party in Germany during the 1930s, prior to the conquest of power by Hitler. And the argument was that
actually they started using the term in the 1920s to describe both the Social Democratic Party and Hindenburg.
Yeah, well, but the conception was that somehow there was no distinction between fascism and the fascist movement and the Social Democratic Party, which at the time was still, despite, I mean, our movement, the Trotskyist movement, Trotsky absolutely opposed the ideas of social fascism. Yeah. And that wasn't on the basis that somehow social democracy the Social Democratic Party was going to lead the socialist revolution. Everyone knew what they did in the aftermath of the war and murdering Luxemburg and Liebknecht. And they actually mobilized the Freikorps at the time, which was a predecessor of the Nazi movement.
Yes.
Would later become part of
and in a real way, the people who taught the young Nazis to be fascists in the first place had been subsidized by the Social Democratic Party.
Yeah, and they were virulently anti-communist and hostile to the revolution and hostile to the Russian Revolution. But we always, our movement always insisted, and Trotsky insisted that that the equation of social democracy and fascism was wrong, and the consequences of it were to actually minimize the significance of and the danger posed by fascism.
Well,
and the line of the Communist Party was, well, after Hitler, us. If Hitler comes to power,
well, that's true.
It won't be a big deal. Trotsky insisted that Hitler coming to power would mean the smashing of.
It's not completely historically true that they said it wouldn't be a big deal. They did say Hitler then us, but that came at the point where all the attempts to actually establish a united front or even a real popular front had failed. The Social Democratic Party had decided not to even run a presidential candidate in 1931, but to instead endorse Hindenburg, who had been their opponent in 1925. Mm-hmm. And he had run in 1925 on a platform, while not outright Nazi, definitely prefigured Hitler. And after being elected, he was the one who made the final decision in a deadlocked Reichstag to make Hitler chancellor.
Yeah, and there's no doubt about the reactionary rotten role of German social democracy during that period. And of course, going back, as you say, to their endorsement of the First World War in 1914. But to say just that they are social fascists is actually to obscure what fascism is as a political movement.
Except, and I will...
And the danger posed to the working class by a fascist dictatorship. And we saw the consequences.
I'm willing to die on this hill to a certain point. If you are an indigenous American or anybody overseas in a colonized country, or anybody who is, I'm not going to say working class, but if you are what Marx would call the lumpen proletariat, it's already a fascist country. If you're in prison right now with coronavirus raging through your prison population because your guards or your for-profit prison is deliberately keeping positive prisoners with the rest of the population, you're living in a fascist country now. In a very real sense, right now, under these conditions, our prisons and the concentration camps on the border that Biden still hasn't closed are becoming death camps because of coronavirus.
Well, I just think that one has to be precise in one's terminology, and fascism has a particular social and political context. It's classically a movement which seeks to mobilize, lumpen elements in the petty bourgeoisie to smash everything that remains of democratic rights. In particular,
that's a real part of it.
At the time, the mass workers' organizations, and I think, one has to make it. If you're going to talk about fascism, you're talking also about just capitalist, society.
I don't
anti-democratic authoritarian.
I don't see a huge distinction. I see fascism as just a mask off of what capitalist society is already doing.
The United States American imperialism has been carrying out atrocities and continues to carry out atrocities for decades. Vietnam, they killed 3 million people in the Vietnamese War. Did that make American society fascist? I think one has to because
not necessarily society, but definitely the American democracy.
I would say that if we lived in if fascism was successful, we would not be speaking here like this right now. If a fascist movement successfully took over the United States, we would not be able to have this conversation. And the point is not to somehow present American society as a flowering democracy. It's certainly not that. There's been decades of assaults on and
I will say
and everything and the camps and everything else.
And I'm not trying to scare you when I say this, but I'm not 100% sure we can have these conversations safely. I'm still having them and I don't intend to stop, but I'm not so sure it's safe anymore.
Well,
and the reason I say that is I live here in Oregon. And yes, this was under Trump and not Biden. But an Antifa activist who killed a white supremacist in self-defense was murdered by U.S. Marshals here in Oregon.
Yeah,
not arrested.
On the order of Trump.
On the order of Trump. However, technically speaking, that was legal. And the reason that was technically legal is because of laws that Biden helped to pass.
Yeah. Well, I think the political issue is, because I think it gets to because we want to talk about what you were referring to earlier, the door issue and the similar questions. I think that what really arises is what was the significance of Trump's efforts to overturn the election and stop the transfer of power, and the significance of the events of January 6th. Because if one's position is just that, well, Biden is also a fascist and we already live in a fascist society, then that was really of no significance. Because
it's not that it was of no significance. It is the Reichstag fire. It is the situation under which more emergency laws will be passed that restrict freedom even further. The same way the Patriot Act was passed after September 11th. Adam Schiff has a counterterrorism law in his pocket right now that Biden is drooling to sign, and that our supposed Democratic Socialists in Congress all support. I haven't heard if Bernie Sanders supports it, but all the people who openly admit to being members of the Democratic Party have voiced some sort of support for it. So it's not going to be a hard sell because of the events on January the 6th, but it is more explicitly fascist than anything that Trump actually put into law. It is going to be the weapon, assuming that Biden is not him, which I don't expect him to be. It's the law that Tom Cotton or Josh Hawley is going to use to take the next step.
I would have a bit of a different analysis. I mean, I think, all right, because it relates to the coronavirus that we're talking about. I mean, Trump, the policy of the Trump administration was herd immunity. Of course, Trump had fascistic characteristics throughout, when he first came to office in 2016. Really, in the past year, they have sought to really cultivate outright fascist organizations, the Proud Boys and the Oath Keepers and and everything else, on the basis of the campaign, to stop any restrictions on the coronavirus pandemic.
Yes, but Biden
enforced the policy of the financial oligarchy. And Trump made clear, he made this point right after the election. He said that, under a Trump administration, we will not lock down. I don't know if I'm going to be president but we will not do that. And of course, Biden said he was opposed to lockdowns as well. But there was an outright fascist movement, and you have these people like Marjorie Taylor Greene and others in the Republican Party who are, a genuine fascist.
The Republican Party is at this point an openly fascist party.
Cultivating. I mean, now the Democratic Party's response to that. What is the Democratic Party's response? It's to cover it up, to prevent,
except I'm going to pull Andrew Cuomo out of my pocket again. Andrew Cuomo in New York as governor fits many of the classic examples of a fascist. Now, he may not have a full-blown fascist dictatorship in New York State, but he has played a lot of games for a long time to keep it something very close to that. And he has openly bullied and threatened and terrorized, and I don't choose the word terrorized lightly, many of his co-party members for years. And he has used the implicit threat of violence to get his way within his system. Now, you can call it gangsterism instead of fascism if you like, and I can see people going in that direction. But he's run things as a strongman. The mayor here in Portland, tear gas Ted Wheeler, is absolutely a tin pot dictator who uses the police as a paramilitary arm of capital as opposed to any sort of law enforcement. Biden openly courted the police unions, which are a fascist organization and which are fundamentally aligned with the Proud Boys and Patriot Prayer. Here in Oregon, during protests, the police refer to anti-fascist protesters as hostiles and fascists as friendlies. Mm-hmm. So it's impossible to ignore that there is, if not open fascism, a strongly fascist element within the Democratic Party, especially in strong executive positions at local and state levels. Call it gangsterism or machine politics or whatever you like, but Mussolini and Hitler ultimately perfected the American style political machine to make it do their bidding. It's really important to remember how much of Hitler's policy was copied directly from 1920s America.
What do you think, Kennedy?
I think it's a messy issue. I think that there's a reason why someone like Richard Spencer was willing to come out and say, "I'll vote for Biden," and that's because
Yes.
there is a fascist project in America that's advancing, and it doesn't necessarily matter which party is in power. The fascist project is advancing. I don't know if I agree that it's all exactly the same or I agree with Chris 100%. I do think that there is a slide into fascism occurring, though.
There is a game that police play with suspects called good cop, bad cop. The good cop's job is to be the suspect's friend and to convince the suspect, no matter what, that he's on his side, that the good cop is on the suspect's side and they're in this together. The bad cop's job is to yell and be scary, possibly violent, terrify people, get them to talk out of fear. And out of fear, people are supposed to turn to the good cop as their ally. But the good cop is on the same team as the bad cop in the end. And every success that the good cop has is equally a success for the bad cop. They're not working against each other with the suspect in the middle. They're playing a game with the suspect as the target of that game.
Well, yeah, and I think that, I mean, first of all, yes, the Democratic and Republican parties are the twin parties of the ruling class. And Biden's response, after the election, the calls for bipartisanship, the insistence there has to be a strong Republican Party, and everything else is an expression of that. These are two parties that represent fundamentally the same class interests, the interests of the financial oligarchy. And the Democrats, while they sort of posture occasionally, that put on their left face, in fact, represent the Wall Street, the American military, the intelligence agencies. This is a right-wing imperialist party. I think, however, what one has begun, what's new in the political situation in the United States with the Trump government, and particularly over the past year with the cultivation of outright fascist, a genuine fascist political tendency in America, is that that's what you have now in the United States, and it's reached a point where a significant faction of the ruling class in the United States is prepared to completely break with what remains of constitutional forms of rule, to overthrow the Constitution, to establish a presidential dictatorship. This is not something that working people can be indifferent to.
No.
Yes, the Democratic Party is a rotten, right-wing, filthy party of the ruling class, but we don't thereby simply dismiss the significance of a movement to completely overturn bourgeois democracy and democratic forms of rule, establish a fascist dictatorship. The working class has to oppose that, and so this is where our line would be, I think, different from what you're right. The working class has to oppose that, not from the standpoint of defending the Democratic Party in any way, but mobilizing its independent strength against the fascist dictatorship.
Well, and I agree with that. I don't think that. Okay. So I believe that when people talk about fascism, they talk about it wrong. I understand the idea of wanting to relate it to a very specific time and place and a very specific set of circumstances, but nothing ever works exactly the same every time. And when things come back, they come back changed and adapted for the world in which they exist. If a socialist revolution ever happens somewhere else, we all hope to do better than Lenin and Stalin ended up doing in the end.
Stalin.
Especially Stalin. But some of those tendencies had already started and were just played against each other for Stalin's maximum advantage. Stalin wasn't an idea person. He was someone who used other people's ideas to his advantage.
Well, I would disagree with that. I mean, this would be a separate discussion, but I think that, you know, what was involved in the break between Lenin and Stalin was a fundamental programmatic shift and the coming to power, or the rise to power, which Stalin represented, of a nationalist bureaucracy, which repudiated socialist internationalism that Lenin fought for, including up to the end of his life, when Lenin sought to establish a political bloc with Trotsky against Stalin.
Stalin is the natural follow-up to any successful revolution, which is you have revolution and then you have reaction.
No, I don't think that's true. I mean, Stalinism was not the inevitable product of the Russian Revolution. It was the product of the isolation of the Russian Revolution in an economically backward country. The failure of and that gets to the issues of Germany.
Yes,
the revolution in Germany. And the social democracy played such a critical role in the assassination of Luxembourg and Liebknecht, absolutely drowning the German Revolution in blood. And that was the role of the German social democracy and the trade unions in Germany as well, or that, you know, that faction. But, you know, there was a workers' revolution in the Soviet Union. I think it gets to the question. All right, so this is but the question, you know, which maybe it'd be good to talk. Well, what's the answer? What is the orientation? What's the political perspective that we have to now fight for? I mean, this is a situation. We're talking about 500,000 people dead, a complete bankruptcy of capitalism. You know, the consequences. Well, what do we have to fight? What's the perspective? What's the program? And I think there, you know, what our movement fights for, the Socialist Equality Party, the World Socialist website, is a perspective of world socialist revolution. That the question, you know, what capitalism has proven bankrupt. The alternative to capitalism is socialism on a world scale. The conquest of power by the working class, the expropriation of the expropriators, the establishment of a workers' state, you know, the reorganization of economic life. But that perspective, that was a perspective of the Russian Revolution. That was a perspective of Lenin and Trotsky. And, you know, I think the historical question, you know, what actually happened in the 20th century actually becomes very critical, because if one has a position that Stalinism was the inevitable product of such a revolution, well, then the conclusion would be, well, then that perspective is hopeless, is bankrupt. We should have such a revolution if the horrors of
reaction
Stalinism
doesn't inevitably win. Reaction is always the inevitable response, but reaction doesn't inevitably win. I should have been clearer about that.
Well, reaction takes different forms. I mean, it takes the form of imperialist counter-revolution. In the Soviet Union, as a result of the isolation, the defeats, and then compounded by the isolation over the period of the 1920s, the impact was to strengthen the nationalist bureaucracy.
Well,
but it was not. I don't think it was. The point is, it was not inevitable.
Oh, I don't think what exactly happened was inevitable. There would have been some kind of reactionary influence that had to be overcome. I don't think it was inevitable that it was Stalin or that he won.
Well, the point, though, that I want to stress is that there was an alternative perspective that was fought for.
Yes,
and that was, in my view, the perspective of Trotsky, the left opposition, and then the Fourth International, which Trotsky moved to form after the victory of Hitler in 1933, when he drew the conclusion that the absolutely catastrophic policy of the Communist Party in Germany, enforced by the Stalinist apparatus, and that included the social fascism line. That the victory of fascism in Germany, the greatest defeat for the German working class in history up to that point, and the failure to have any substantial no opposition within the Communist International to that policy, a new international had to be built, the Fourth International, which was then formed in 1938, and that's what our movement is, which publishes the World Socialist website. But that's perspective. I mean, what are we going to fight for now? I think that's the question that millions of workers and young people are going to ask. I mean, the impact of this catastrophe, of the pandemic, it's like World War I in that, it has a profound impact on the consciousness of masses of people. It has comprehensively exposed the bankruptcy of all existing political institutions, the state, the media, the trade unions, everything, the pseudo-intelligentsia. But what is the perspective that then has to be fought for? What are we going to now, what is the alternative? And, I think that's the question that people are going to be asking. And, all right, millions of people are interested in socialism, but how is socialism going to be achieved?
I think that's a good lead.
It's going to be achieved through the DSA.
Yes, this is our lead. This is the perfect time to pull this up, because this actually ties, interestingly enough, and I don't know how much. I'm assuming that you do know this, but I don't know how much all of my viewers know this. The DSA is the ultimate endpoint of ex-Trotskyists. The founder of Social Democrats of America, Social Democrats USA, Bayard Rustin, was a close associate of Max Schachtman, who was one of the last, who was one of the American Trotskyist leaders during the Depression, and who became increasingly right-wing, and eventually, before he died, almost a neoconservative, though neoconservatism wasn't a thing yet. And Michael Harrington, who started the DSA, split off from Social Democrats USA over the Vietnam War. Yeah. And the idea that we needed to be anti-war. But this whole plan, which started with Schachtman, was an attempt to realign the Democratic Party around a very specific set of civil rights and working class principles that they thought would lay the groundwork to turn it into a real socialist party. How's that going?
Well, just to elaborate on the background, which I do think is important, Schachtman split with the Trotskyist movement in 1939, along with two others, Burnham, who went on, actually moved very sharply to the right more quickly and became a leading ideologist of the Republican right. I think he was awarded the Medal of Freedom by Ronald Reagan in the 1980s.
Yes, no, that's worth noting too.
Yeah, but Schachtman then, he was very close to the trade union apparatus. He moved to the right throughout the 1940s.
Yes.
Harrington was very close to Schachtman for a long period of time, including during the Vietnam War. He covered for Schachtman for an extensive period of time, but really only split with Schachtman at the point when they became open supporters of Vietnam and more or less were supporting Nixon.
Yes.
Time and Harrington was oriented more to McGovern at the time, and there was a certain break, but it was not really a principled break. And Harrington then went on to form the DSA, and his line was building the left wing of the possible, which meant the left wing of what was acceptable to the ruling class and the Democratic Party. And as that has moved further and further to the right, the DSA has moved further to the right.
Exactly, which is inevitable if you're based on this narrow idea of what's possible.
Yeah, Schachtman, by the way, the point you make is, I mean, he became an absolute supporter of war, and the whole layer around him then actually moved. They were around Scoop Jackson, a pro-war Democrat who supported the Vietnam War.
And
and ultimately they moved to the ultimately they moved to the Republican Party.
They did, and it was
but
all
the DSA, that's it's a faction of the Democratic Party. I think what the question is asking about, I think is a significant issue, because the DSA and Sankara in particular, who's the editor of Jacobin magazine, their response to the events of January 6th was essentially to deny the significance of what was happening. And Sankara tweeted on the day of January 6th, he said, he said that Republican institutions in the United States are strong, and they have an inestimable faith in the strength of American democracy, and particularly the Democratic Party. The whole orientation is, the Democrats can be pressured to the left, and the incoming Biden administration is riven by a contradiction between whether it's going to go to the right and to the left, which is complete nonsense. But there was a campaign. There is an ongoing campaign of the DSA, and particularly Jacobin, to downplay the significance of the danger of fascism, which I think is bound up with the fact that to acknowledge the threat, to acknowledge the reality of the breakdown of democracy, is to acknowledge the bankruptcy of their own perspective of reform. Because what's really raised by the crisis of American democracy, and this is repeated internationally as well, is that the alternatives confronting mankind are not, fascism or sort of social reform. There's no program of social reform. The alternative is fascism or socialist revolution, and they're as opposed to that as the Democratic Party itself.
That's true.
Because I do think the sort of diminishing of the significance, because there's this line among sort of some of these layers of the Jimmy Dore types and this sort of thing. The line is that, if you acknowledge the danger of fascism, you're really supporting the Democratic Party. And I would say...
So it's worse than that. It's worse than that, because I'm an anarchist. I talk to anarchists. I have anarchist friends. Anarchists are an odd bunch, which I suppose is inevitable. But so a lot of anarchists react very well to someone who looks like me because I'm scruffy. I look like what they expect from someone who doesn't follow the rules. If they see someone who's more clean cut and professional and erudite is always a good word. They see someone who more fits into their stereotype of what they think the boss looks like. They see that person as part of the elite, even if that person is not part of the elite. They see a petty bourgeois Norse pagan with suspicious anti-communist claims in his organization, and then they say, well, I have more in common with these guys than I do with those guys in suits who say they're socialists like me. And there are people who actually said to me, no, left libertarians have more in common with right libertarians than with socialists. And I looked at him and, are you on drugs? But there's this real attitude that somehow fascists aren't fascists if they're libertarians, which is a failure to understand the fact that all the founding economists of libertarianism were Germans or Austrians who, if you really look into their work, didn't terribly disapprove of Hitler. And it's just, one of the founding economists of libertarianism wrote that you had to get Democrats, homosexuals, and communists completely out of society. Well, how are you going to do that? And of course, he meant small d Democrats, people who believed in democracy, not the Democratic Party. I should be clear about that.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think it's a superficial approach to politics to determine one's, to say the least, to determine one's political attitude to someone based upon, their haircut.
Yeah.
It used to be said that among the Trotskyists, the Trotskyists were always the ones wearing a suit and tie, and it was because because Trotskyists. It was also actually our movement was very much rooted in a rejection of sort of the hippie middle class politics of the 1960s, and there was. It was actually not just the Trotskyist movement. The Black Panthers would also, would dress because they took themselves serious. I think this is a secondary question, but the point is that there's a distinction between a sort of middle class sort of anarcho-libertarianism type of sort of approach to politics and a scientific Marxist approach to politics. And I guess you're talking about the Boogaloo Boys interview and
yes,
and the reaction to this guy, this Boogaloo boy with Jimmy Dore, and
they thought people who saw him and who are favorably inclined towards Jimmy Dore saw how impressed Jimmy Dore was and thought, this guy is like us. We've got allies now.
All right. Well, you have to judge by politics. The fact of the matter was this Boogaloo boy guy. In terms of what we're talking about at the beginning, and Jerry really stressed this point about the pandemic, their program was end the restrictions.
Yes.
That was the program. That was a program he was advancing on Dore's show.
Yes.
Which was precisely the program which Trump sought to mobilize these far-right fascistic groups on. And then Dore says, well, I agree with you on everything. We should, we should have, common front with the people who are insisting on a policy that has led to the deaths of 500,000 people in the United States. And then when Jerry was talking about, the significance of the pandemic, Dore was going, oh, COVID, all you want to talk about COVID. There's 500,000 people dead.
Yes.
And it's like, oh, well, this is, not the fact that this guy, is advocating a policy of the abolition of all restrictions on the virus. He would be denouncing the Chicago teachers for refusing to go back to school.
Another ex-Trotskyist who became a Republican is a gentleman named David Horowitz. David Horowitz is one of the more terrible people who was associated with the W. Bush administration.
I don't think David Horowitz was ever a Trotskyist. He was around the Shachtman movement.
Yeah.
After Shachtman has long broken from Trotskyism.
Fair enough. He is someone who is perceived as a former Trotskyist by a lot of people. Let's put it that way.
Yeah. Well, that's based on a fundamental misreading of
fair enough. But Horowitz is the mentor of Stephen Miller. Horowitz was very close to a man named John Tanton, who specifically advocated what's called passive eugenics, which is basically to go with Thomas Malthus's idea of just let poor people die.
Mm-hmm.
And this was fundamentally important to Trump's COVID policy, this idea of letting poor people die.
Yeah.
And it's become Biden's policy. And those connections, it's interesting that a whole bunch of the people who have been given jobs in Biden's administration are failed Democratic congressional candidates who took a lot of, and this is a weird segue, a lot of pro-Modi money from various American groups like that are associated with Modi's party in various ways.
We're talking about the BJP in India?
Yes, and the RSS here in America and several other groups that front for the BJP. A lot of Democrats who took money from U.S. groups affiliated with the BJP and lost their races are now in the Biden administration. Now, I'm not going to say 100% that the BJP is a clear-cut Nazi party, but the BJP has disturbing parallels to Western fascism.
No, absolutely. And I would categorize it also with Bolsonaro in Brazil and in the Philippines.
Duterte
in the Philippines. You certainly have this sort of, I mean, you know, when talking about
right-wing dictatorships, let's say that instead of fascism.
It's a complex sort of political phenomenon, fascism. And historically, there were distinctions even between Mussolini and Hitler, not to mention Franco in Spain and Pétain in France. And then you had the various movements in Latin America, sort of authoritarian, fascistic dictatorships.
Sort of certain wannabe Francos is the best way to describe.
Yeah, and so it's a complex political phenomenon. But what I do think is important to sort of understand in terms of American politics is that there's a real political transformation. And the impact of the pandemic, it's not going away under Biden. You have, of course, didn't come out of nowhere. It's not like it sort of comes out of Trump's head. It's the product of decades of unrelenting growth of social inequality, the destruction of democratic rights, the war on terror, and Obama's drone programs and torture as American policy, and the consequences of endless. I mean, it comes out of that.
From the Moynihan Report in 1965 to Bill Clinton to Barack Obama. Well,
it's a long process, but I think there's a certain political turning point, and where you have because look, I mean, for the American ruling class, breaking with the Constitution is not a sort of straightforward matter. I mean, what holds the country together? What is preventing a civil war in the United States? I mean, there's a Constitution.
Well,
and to completely break with that is a significant political step.
Because of the nature of American nationalism and the fact that the American political religion is built differently than the German political religion or the Italian political religion or the Spanish political religion. Fascism is going to have an American character and is going to use symbols like the flag and the Constitution to its advantage rather than advocate a complete break with them. Because that's the political religion here. You can't have a nationalist movement in America that completely rejects the Constitution. You have to implement the Constitution into your system somehow. And let's be honest, there is a lot more that's anti-democratic in the Constitution than there is that is democratic. There's one democratic portion of the federal government, and that's the House of Representatives. The Senate is deliberately designed to hold the democracy represented by the House of Representatives in check. The Electoral College prevents the president from being democratically elected at all. And of course, the judicial branch is mostly appointed by the president. So the Constitution is not the only part of the Constitution that is incompatible with a fascism with American characteristics is the Bill of Rights. And the Republican Party has already shown that you can manipulate the Bill of Rights to make them mean the exact opposite of what they mean, with things like the freedom of religion argument that says, no, Freedom of religion doesn't mean we can't persecute other religions. It means that if you tell us we can't persecute other people, you're persecuting us.
Well, I don't agree.
I understand.
With certain basic elements of your analysis. I mean, one has to go into there's a lot of historical questions. I mean, there's no question but the Constitution is what it is. You know, it's the product of a bourgeois revolution. But there are critical democratic
not bourgeois
inscribed in the Constitution.
It is the
democratic rights that have then been won and expanded over the course of long and bitter struggles, including the Civil War, which resulted in an expansion of democratic rights, of course, the abolition of slavery.
Yes.
And then in the struggles, you know, in the post-Civil War period, the struggles of workers generally involved a fight which led to an expansion of democratic rights. Yeah. That is all being eliminated. And I think there's something to defend. There's democratic rights to defend. You don't defend democratic rights within the framework of capitalism, however. One has to defend democratic rights through the mobilization of the working class in opposition to capitalism in the fight for socialism. And that's where the question of, you know, we insist that there is a real danger of a real fascist, and there was. The January 6th was an attempt to overthrow the Constitution in America and establish a dictatorship. That was and continues to be a real threat that workers have to oppose. But you don't oppose it through subordinating the struggle to the Democratic Party, which has proven it will not fight against this, that it will collaborate, that it will cultivate, that it will seek to strengthen the Republican Party as an incubator of these tendencies. It has to be done through a struggle to develop a movement in the working class against the whole capitalist system, against the whole policy in response to the pandemic, against the whole, you know, nature against the financial oligarchy, against, you know, the whole social and economic system, uniting with struggles of workers all over the world. That's really, I think, the political axis upon which a socialist movement needs to be built. But we'll disagree on a certain.
Well, I still think we agree on more than we disagree in the big picture, and that's one of the reasons that you're on this show instead of the guy who said he thought he had more in common with the Boogaloo Boys than with Jerry.
Yeah, no, that was an extraordinary, you know, and then that guy was then interviewed by Alex Jones a couple of days later, and Alex Jones, this outright fascist, who was at January 6th, and it was at the rally, was going on about how he thought Jimmy Dore's interview was really great.
And Jimmy Dore ignored a couple of the most important things that guy said in the interview itself. He said he preferred private health care to Medicare for all, which should have been an immediate.
Well, and there was another guest that came on later who pointed to this guy's statements about Kyle Rittenhouse in Kenosha, basically defending Kyle Rittenhouse and you know, everything else. I mean, it's, but there's an orientation because, you know, within a certain layer, you know, there's actually a sort of conception that somehow Trump and the Trump sort of phenomenon are anti-establishment, or that somehow they represent the working class. That January 6th was a working class protest, which is absolutely false as a matter of fact.
Totally false.
It was not a work, even in the actual composition.
The working class members of the protest were astroturfed there by rich people.
Yeah. They're ex-military, ex-police,
the majority
small businesses.
The majority of the participants, like the majority of the Republican Party and the majority of Trump supporters, were resentful petty bourgeois who believe that the PMC folks that they see on TV are the real elites, and that they and the billionaires are oppressed together.
Well, that's not how you build a working class movement.
No,
it's in opposition to this, and to take this threat seriously, you know, but to fight, to mobilize, and I think that's really our orientation. What's the fight of the social? We're oriented to the development of an independent movement in the working class. That really has to be the orientation, that workers have to intervene into this process.
Well, and I think a lot of this just comes down to these fundamental questions of who do we ally with? And maybe Joseph and Chris, you two don't agree on absolutely everything politically, but you recognize in each other, a safe ally in these political struggles, even if you don't agree on 100% of everything. Whereas when we look at the Boogaloo Boys, those of us who are wise enough to see it immediately know that's not an ally. And I think what's important that's so crucial here is that not everybody that wants to tear down the system wants to replace it with something better. It doesn't matter how bad the system is now. There are some people that could still find a way to make it worse. And those are like the ultra fascists that are out there in the streets, and that's the Boogaloo Boys. That's the Proud Boys. Those are these groups.
Yes.
These are the absolute farthest right that people can be.
Yes.
And they don't want to ally with us because, let's tear down this terrible system and make it better. Their better system would be people like me just die. I get shot on like day one, and that if a pandemic comes, hold on to your ass and pray for something because it's not coming from us, their system would be the absolute, just get fucked system. And so we can't ally with people like that.
So the one thing that I always take comfort from is the fact that when the loyalist side of the Spanish Civil War started to fray, the Trotskyists and the anarchists stuck together against the Stalinists. So the history says that at least some socialists have more in common with anarchists than anarchists have with fascists.
Well, the Stalinists were intervening in that and to insist that the factories had to be turned back over to the capitalists after the anarchists had. But on the other, there were real political conflicts, including between the Trotskyist movement and the anarchists.
Of course.
And when the anarchists then joined a bourgeois government in Catalonia, that was, that we argue that the actual logical sort of outcome of the idea that, of no state, that is a sort of idea that, somehow there's going to be socialism without the establishment of a workers' state.
There has to be. You're never going to get rid of the state because if you have a real vacuum, something always fills it.
Well, but so the alternative to the bourgeois state is a workers' state.
Exactly.
The establishment of workers' power. But that's traditionally where the anarchists and the Marxists have diverged.
No, I still agree with that.
So okay. Well, that's what we're fighting for, a workers' state. I mean, I think that's we live in a revolutionary epoch now. I mean, because like the rise of fascism is only one side of it, and in the end, it's an expression of weakness on the part of the ruling elite.
Well, yes,
because they can't any longer, But there's an enormous, powerful social force, which is really, much strong. I mean. Of course, the ruling class is strong in many ways. It has the apparatus of the state and the media and everything else. But the working class, multi-billion, international, when unified, when organized, when conscious, and when led with a political program and perspective, is the strongest force on the planet. And I think that, we're entering a period now where workers, the expression of the class struggle over such an extended period of time is going to break apart. And, there's going to be, social struggles unlike anything that's been seen in a long time.
I tend to see the two major parties as the billionaires successfully playing the PMC and the petty squad against each other to keep the working class out of the picture.
With the PMC?
Professional managerial class. Sorry. So basically, to use really simple logic, the Democratic Party represents the very top tier of the working class that has actually, in material benefits from our capitalist society, actually somewhat more successful in purely financial terms than the lowest tier of the ownership class. And the lowest tier of the ownership class resents these people who actually are not necessarily very different in them from class, see them as somehow the real expression of tyranny in America, and not the billionaires they work for. Because they associate the Democratic Party and the sort of urban professional that they represent with their boss.
Well, in some sense they are.
Yes.
But that doesn't mean, that's the Democratic Party.
But that's really my class analysis is the professional managerial class and the petty bourgeois being played against each other to the benefit of the ruling class billionaires and at the expense of everyone else.
Yeah, and the working class completely excluded from political life.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Well, that's going to change.
And
I agree.
I think that's something we can all agree to work for.
Okay.
Yeah. Right. Well, this was a really wonderful conversation, I thought. I know that, there was a little disagreement here and there, but I still thought there were a lot of interesting things to be shared, and I hope to have the opportunity to speak with you again, Joseph.
Yeah, it was great. I was glad to be here. Yeah. I mean, a lot of issues came up to be worth discussing further. It's a lot of complex historical questions.
Always a pleasure. I am sure to ask you back again. We always have great arguments that lead to at least good partial synthesis in the end. So
I just encourage everyone listening to go to the World Socialist website, wsws.org, if you want to find out more about our movement.
At WSWS _updates on Twitter.
Oh yeah, that's the Twitter. Yeah.
Also, I definitely encourage you to follow at J Kishore and at Kennedy T Cooper if you're not already. Is there anything anybody else would like to say before we close out?
No, thanks for having me. Glad I could be on here again. Looking forward to next discussion.
Awesome. Both of you have a great night. And as always, I hope all our viewers have a great night. Thanks, folks, and take care.